The Duke received a ruined house instead of an inheritance. What he found inside shocked everyone. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October of 1889, delivered by a courier whose mud-splattered coat suggested a journey of considerable length. Henry Ashford, the 6th Duke of Crestmore, received it at his London townhouse over a breakfast he had barely touched, his appetite stolen, as it so often was in those days, by the persistent weight of financial anxiety pressing against the back of every thought. He was 34 years old. He was unmarried, deliberately so, though not without consequence. He was possessed of a title older than the century, and an estate that demanded more of him each year than it returned. A quiet suffocation dressed in the language of inheritance and duty. His dark hair carried the first threads of grey at the temples, not from age precisely, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent a decade managing a legacy rather than living one. The letter bore the seal of a solicitor he did not recognize, operating from a firm in the town of Whitmore, in the county of Somerset. Its contents were brief, almost startlingly so for news of such consequence. A distant relation, one Cornelius Ashford, a cousin twice removed whom Henry had met exactly once at a family gathering some 20 years prior, and who had made no memorable impression on him whatsoever, had passed away without direct heirs. In the absence of any nearer claimant, his estate had fallen to Henry by default. The estate was called Blackthorn Manor. Henry set the letter down beside his teacup and read it again, slowly this time, searching the spare legal language for any indication of value, of acreage, of income. He found nothing encouraging. The solicitor's language was careful in the way that lawyers are careful when they have nothing good to say and are obliged to say something nonetheless. Words like modest and requiring attention appeared with the frequency of apology. The phrase long unoccupied appeared twice. He asked his secretary to arrange a journey to Somerset within the week. The train carried him westward through England on a grey morning that seemed to have forgotten it was still technically autumn. The countryside beyond the window was beautiful in the resigned way of things preparing for winter, all amber and brown, and the particular dark green of hedgerows that have stood for centuries. Henry watched it pass with the expression of a man steeling himself for news he already suspects will be unwelcome. He had brought his man of business, a precise and quietly pessimistic fellow named Calder, whose function on this journey was to assess the property with the unsparing eye of someone who understood balance sheets better than sentiment. Henry had also brought a single trunk, enough for a stay of several days, and the private conviction that Blackthorn Manor would prove to be a complete ruin, requiring either substantial investment or swift disposal. The village of Ashwick, nearest to the manor, was reached by a hired carriage from the station at Frome. The road that led through Ashwick was narrow and well kept, the village itself unexpectedly pleasant, with a stone church whose tower had stood since the reign of Elizabeth, and a handful of shops arranged around a modest square. Henry noticed the way the carriage-driver's manner shifted when he gave the destination. There was no dramatic response, no widened eyes or startled pause, merely a slight tightening around the mouth. the particular economy of expression that village people adopt when they have opinions they consider it wiser not to voice to strangers. The road to Blackthorn Manor led away from the village through a dense corridor of ash trees, whose branches met overhead and filtered the October light into something dim and atmospheric. The trees had not been trimmed in years, perhaps decades, and they pressed close on either side with an intimacy that felt less welcoming than enclosing. Calder sat across from Henry in the carriage and said nothing, which was itself a form of commentary. The manor revealed itself gradually, by degrees, as the carriage rounded a long curve in the drive. It was large, larger than Henry had expected, a Georgian house of pale stone, 3 stories, with tall windows that would have been elegant had they not been so uniformly coated in the grey film of long neglect. The south wing showed visible damage to its roof line, slates displaced or missing entirely, and the facade was partially obscured by a growth of ivy so thick and so advanced that it had begun to consume the stonework, rather than merely decorate it. The grounds were not so much overgrown as they were returned.
Good morning.
The formal garden that must once have occupied the space before the front entrance was now indistinguishable from the surrounding land, its geometry entirely dissolved back into nature. Henry descended from the carriage and stood in the gravel, or what had once been gravel, now largely reclaimed by grass, and studied the house in silence for a long moment. Calder came to stand beside him and produced a small notebook in which he immediately began writing things down. This was either a professional reflex or a way of avoiding the necessity of speaking, and Henry appreciated it regardless. The solicitor from Whitmore, a Mr. Phelps, was waiting for them at the front entrance. A round-faced man of middle age, who had the look of someone who had prepared himself for an uncomfortable meeting, and was finding it precisely as uncomfortable as anticipated. He shook Henry's hand with the excessive firmness of the professionally apologetic, and produced a ring of keys from his coat pocket with the air of a man surrendering something. The front door opened with the complaint of hinges that had not been oiled in a very long time. Inside, the house was cold in the way that abandoned places are cold, not merely low in temperature, but drained of the particular warmth that human habitation generates, as though the air itself had grown unused to being breathed. The entrance hall was generous in proportion, with a staircase that swept upward in a graceful double curve, its banisters still intact, though coated in dust. The wallpaper, a deep burgundy pattern of some floral design, had begun to separate from the plaster in long curling strips along the upper sections of the walls. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals dulled, one section of its arm bent at an angle that suggested it had been struck by something some years past and never repaired. Henry walked slowly through the ground floor rooms, while Mr. Phelps narrated and Calder wrote. The library still held books, hundreds of them, their spines intact, though warped with damp. The drawing room contained furniture draped in dust sheets, the shapes beneath them ghostly and indeterminate. The dining room had a long table of dark mahogany that had survived the years with a dignity the rest of the house could not entirely claim. The kitchen was large and cold and unutterably still. It was in the kitchen that Henry first noticed the cup. It sat on the long wooden work table at the kitchen's centre, a plain ceramic cup of the sort used by servants rather than family. It was not dusty. It was, in fact, entirely clean, and beside it sat a small plate bearing the remnants of a meal. Bread, recently cut, and the end of a piece of hard cheese. The plate was not dirty precisely, but it was used, recently used. The bread had not yet hardened at its cut edge, in the way that bread does after a day or two of exposure. Henry stood very still and looked at the cup and the plate. He did not say anything to Mr. Phelps, who was at that moment delivering some commentary on the state of the kitchen's plumbing. He said nothing to Calder, who was writing measurements in his notebook. He simply filed the observation away, with the quiet precision of a man accustomed to noticing details that other people overlook. He did not mention the cup that evening when they took rooms at the village inn, and sat down to a late supper of lamb stew and bread that was nothing like the bread he had seen at the manor. Mr. Phelps departed after the meal, having conveyed all the legal particulars that duty required, and visibly relieved to have done so. Calder went to his room early with his notebook, and a headache he mentioned only in passing. Henry sat alone by the inn's fire, with a glass of port he did not particularly want, and thought about a cup that had been washed and set out on a kitchen table in a house that was supposed to be empty. He returned to the manor the following morning alone, leaving Calder to conduct his written assessments and sending word to Mr. Phelps that his presence would not be required. He rode the distance on a horse hired from the village stable, arriving at Blackthorn shortly after 9, when the autumn mist still lay in the low places of the grounds, and the light came sideways through the ash trees with the thin clarity of early morning. He entered through the front door, whose lock he had retained the key to, and moved quietly through the entrance hall and down the corridor toward the kitchen. He was not by nature a man who moved quietly. It was not a skill that his particular life had demanded, but he had learned it as a young man during years at school where the ability to move through spaces without announcing oneself had proven occasionally useful, and the skill had not entirely left him. The kitchen was not empty. She stood at the work table with her back to the door, attending to something in a large ceramic bowl, with the focused economy of motion of someone who had performed this task many times. She was dressed simply, in a dark grey dress of good quality, but considerable age. Her dark hair gathered at the nape of her neck in a manner that was practical rather than fashionable. She was not young in the way of girls fresh out of the schoolroom, but neither was she of middle age. Somewhere in the range of 27 or 28, Henry estimated, though her bearing made her seem at once older and younger than any number could precisely capture. There was a composure about her, even in the simple act of kneading dough, which was what she was doing, he realized, that spoke less of ease than of long practice at containing whatever it was she actually felt. She knew he was there before he announced himself. He was certain of it. The slight adjustment in her shoulders, the fractional pause in her hands, the way she completed exactly 3 more movements before turning, these were not the responses of a woman caught unawares. They were the responses of a woman who had been expecting this particular morning for some time and had decided precisely how she would meet it. When she turned, her face was composed and her eyes were direct. She was, Henry noted with the involuntary assessment that he could never entirely suppress, remarkably composed for someone discovered in a house that did not belong to her. Her eyes were grey-green and held in them a quality he could not immediately name. Not defiance exactly, and not fear exactly, but something that contained elements of both, without being reducible to either. He introduced himself. She already knew who he was, she told him, in a voice that was quiet and precise and carried no apology in it. She had been informed of Cornelius Ashford's passing and the subsequent transfer of the estate, and she had been preparing herself for this conversation for several weeks. Her name was Eleanor Whitcomb. She had been residing at Blackthorn Manor for 3 years. She did not flinch from either statement. Henry absorbed this with the external calm that was perhaps his most thoroughly developed social skill, and asked, in a tone that gave nothing away, by what arrangement she had been occupying the late Mr. Cornelius Ashford's property. By his invitation, she said. And then she said nothing more. He asked if she would be willing to explain the nature of that arrangement, and she said that she would be willing to explain some of it, and that the rest of it she was not yet prepared to discuss, and that she hoped he would be patient enough to allow her to address the matter in the order in which she judged it sensible to address it, rather than in the order his questions demanded. Henry had not, in 34 years, encountered a woman who requested patience from him in quite that particular tone, as though patience were a reasonable expectation rather than a conditional gift. He was not entirely certain what he felt about it. He was, however, certain that he was more interested in remaining in this conversation than he had been in remaining in any conversation in some considerable time. He agreed to her terms. She made tea. It was, Henry would later think, an entirely characteristic response to the situation she was in. The circumstances were objectively precarious. She was an unmarried woman of uncertain means, occupying a house that now belonged to someone she had never met, and that someone had just walked through her kitchen door with all the authority of legal ownership and the unpredictability of an unknown quantity. Most people in those circumstances would have either become excessively conciliatory or retreated into formal remoteness. Eleanor Whitcomb made tea, and she did it with the unhurried competence of someone who understood that difficult conversations are marginally better conducted over something warm. She told him the essential facts as the tea steeped, and he sat at the kitchen table in a manor house that was technically his, in a chair that was more comfortable than it looked. Her father had been a man of business with connections to the Ashford family through some commercial arrangement that had developed over many years into a form of friendship between him and Cornelius. Unconventional as such friendships between men of different stations could be, when her father's business had failed through a combination of poor judgment, misplaced trust, and the particular cruelty of circumstances that chose their moment with a timing that suggested personal malice. He had lost not only his fortune, but his reputation, and the two losses together had produced in relatively short order his death. Her father had died 18 months before her arrival at
Morning, Mrs.
Blackthorn.
Davenport. Good
He
morning.
had died,
Pleasure to
leaving
meet your
Eleanor
acquaintance,
without
and yours as
income,
well.
without
The
a
kitchen,
suitable
don't you think? It is
establishment,
indeed.
and without the social standing
Italian
that might
party arrangements.
otherwise have opened doors. She had,
almost see them.
in the years between his ruin and his death, been employed as a governess in a household in Wiltshire, whose name she offered without elaboration. When that employment had ended, for reasons she did not detail and Henry did not press, Cornelius Ashford had written to her with an offer. He had known her father. He had respected him, despite everything. He had the manor, which was unused, and she had nowhere to go. The arrangement was one of convenience, and Henry inferred from the way she described it a form of quiet mercy offered without the performance of charity that would have made it impossible for her to accept. She had come to Blackthorn not as a guest precisely, and not as a servant precisely, but as a kind of custodian, living in the smallest habitable portion of the house, maintaining what she could maintain, and in exchange having a roof and a measure of solitude that she had, she said, come to value more than she had ever expected. She had been there for 3 years when Cornelius died. Henry sat with this for a moment. Outside, the mist was beginning to lift from the lower grounds, and the autumn light was improving. The kitchen was not warm. The fire she had lit was modest, but it was less cold than the rest of the house, and the tea was good, made with an attention to the process that he appreciated without comment. He asked about the secrets. It was not a polished question, and he was aware of it. But the word had been in his mind since the moment he first saw the cup on the table the previous day, and it seemed preferable to pretend he was asking something else. She looked at him with the expression of a woman recalibrating, not unpleasantly, and said that she supposed she had known that was what he was really asking. There were letters, she said, a great many of them, stored in the library, in the locked section of the lower shelves. Cornelius had kept them there over many decades, and she had been instructed, in the letter he had sent her when he knew he was dying, to ensure they reached the right hands and not the wrong ones. She had been waiting, in effect, to meet the man who inherited Blackthorn, and to determine whether he was the right kind of person before she handed over anything. Henry asked what criteria she had been using to make that determination. She considered this with evident seriousness, and said that she had been watching how he looked at things. It was not the most satisfying answer he had ever received. It was, however, one of the more interesting ones. He asked if he had passed the assessment. She said it was too soon to tell, and she poured him more tea. He stayed that day far longer than he had intended. He walked through the house with her, she who knew it intimately, who could point to where the roof leaked most dangerously and where the structural integrity remained sound, who knew which doors were simply swollen with damp and which were genuinely compromised, who had spent 3 years in a relationship with the building that was closer to understanding than anything his brief inspection of the previous day could claim. She moved through the rooms with the ease of long familiarity, and spoke about the house with an affection that she made no effort to conceal, which he found unexpectedly affecting. The library was the room she loved most. He could tell by the way she walked into it. a slight release in her posture, a fraction of relaxation, and by the fact that the bookshelves on her side of the room were not dusty. The books she had been reading over 3 years of solitary occupation formed a kind of autobiography in their selection. Philosophy, natural history, poetry of the previous century, a great deal of history, one shelf of novels whose spines showed the wear of multiple readings. She had left her mark on the room in the way that readers do, not by altering it, but by inhabiting it so thoroughly that her presence had become part of its texture. He did not ask about the locked section of the lower shelves. Not that day. He recognized instinctively that pushing too quickly would close something that was presently open, and he had spent enough time in enough negotiations, over estate matters, over legal complications, over the 1,000 varieties of difficulty that attended the management of a title and its obligations, to understand the value of allowing things to develop at the pace their own nature demanded. What he did that evening, returning to the village inn as the light failed and the ash trees closed overhead in the dark, was send word to Calder that his stay in Somerset would be extended by at least a week. Calder received this information with the expression of a man who had begun to suspect something of the sort, and had prepared himself accordingly. Henry returned to Blackthorn the following morning, and the morning after that. The arrangement was never formally discussed, which was perhaps what made it possible. He came each day. He moved through the house with the intention of understanding it, and she was there. And they developed over the course of those October mornings a kind of parallel existence that was not quite companionship and not quite professional consultation, but contained elements of both. She was not warm. Warmth was not her natural idiom. But she was honest and she was precise, and she had a quality of attention when she listened to someone speak that was rare enough to be remarkable. He began to learn the details of her, the way she held herself very still when she was deciding something, as though stillness were a form of deliberation, the way she walked in the library, not as people walk through rooms they merely pass through, but as a person walks through a space they have, over years, come to regard as an extension of their interior life. The way she knew the history of every object in the house that had survived neglect, which painting had been acquired by which generation of Ashfords, which piece of furniture bore a repair made by a particular craftsman in a particular decade. Knowledge accumulated not through research, but through the long attention of a woman who had spent 3 years in careful, solitary observation. She had not made herself small in this house, he realized. She had made herself present. That distinction mattered. On the 5th day, when the autumn had deepened and the evenings come earlier and the house had begun, under Henry's direction, to show the first signs of restoration, a plumber sent for from Frome, a carpenter engaged to assess the south wing's roof. She took him to the library and unlocked the lower shelves. The letters were bundled in packets tied with ribbon that had faded from what must once have been red to a dusty coral. Dozens of packets, each labelled in a hand that was careful and old-fashioned, with dates spanning more than 40 years. Henry stood before them and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives sometimes in the presence of unexpected things, that he was looking at something of considerable significance, though he could not yet have said precisely why. Eleanor stood beside him and said nothing. She had the quality, rarer than it should be, of understanding when silence was not absence, but accompaniment. He took the earliest packet first. He sat in the chair by the library window, her chair, though neither of them acknowledged this, and he read. The letters were from a woman. Her name, when she signed it at all, was Catherine, and she had written to Cornelius over the span of more than 4 decades, with a consistency and intimacy that spoke of a relationship whose nature had never been formalized, but whose depth was undeniable. Catherine had been, Henry gathered slowly from the accumulation of decades, a woman who had loved Cornelius Ashford from the time they were young and who had not been permitted to marry him. The circumstances were referenced obliquely, in the way that people of that era referenced the obstacles of class and expectation, as though the naming of them too directly would give them a kind of extra, unnecessary power. She had married someone else, someone appropriate, someone whose name appeared in the letters with the mute regularity of a fact to be lived with, rather than a person to be engaged. She had written to Cornelius anyway, and he had kept every letter, and the letters together formed a complete record of a life lived at one remove from its own most essential truth. Henry read for a very long time. The afternoon light moved through the library window and fell differently as the hours passed. At some point, Eleanor brought him a plate of bread and cold meat and set it on the table beside him without comment, and then went back to whatever she had been doing. He did not look up when she did this, and she did not expect him to. When he finally set the last letter down, the room was in the grey light of late afternoon, and Eleanor was sitting in the other chair across the fireplace. A fire, modest but real, was burning, she having built it at some point during the afternoon in the quiet way that she did everything, and she was reading one of her own books. She looked up when he put the letters down, not with the attentiveness of someone who has been watching and waiting, but with the natural attention of someone who has been doing something else entirely, and simply registered a change in the room. He said, without planning to say precisely this, that Cornelius must have loved her very much to keep them. Eleanor looked at the packets in Henry's hands and said that she thought keeping them was itself a form of love, that the act of preservation was what Cornelius had been able to give when the giving of other things had not been possible. He thought about that for longer than the observation perhaps required. He asked who Catherine had been. Eleanor said that Catherine had been a real person, that she had died some years before Cornelius, and that she had had children and grandchildren who were still living, and that, in her opinion, the letters should eventually find their way to the family, not for the sake of scandal or disruption, but because knowing that a person had been loved with that completeness, even at a distance and over decades, seemed to her something a family ought to know about their ancestor. It was not a shameful thing to have been loved, she said, even when the circumstances of that love were complicated by all the constraints that circumstance and society and the particular injustices of one's era made binding. Henry said that he agreed with her, The fire settled. Outside, the ash trees were moving in a wind that had come up from the west, and the sound they made, a sustained, complex rustling, like the turning of 1,000 pages, came through the library window in a way that was not unpleasant. He asked how she had come to know the letter's contents. She said that Cornelius had told her, in the last months of his life, when he knew he was dying and had been engaging in the kind of retrospective accounting that dying men undertake, he had told her about Catherine. He had never shown her the letters. Those were private, she said, with a precision that suggested she had respected that privacy absolutely. But he had spoken about the woman he had loved, and about the life they had not been allowed to build together, and about the strange completeness he had found in the letters themselves, as though the correspondence had become a kind of relationship with its own substance and texture, separate from and yet continuous with the love that had generated it. She said that Cornelius had told her she would understand what to do with them when the time came. Henry looked at her and understood, for the first time and with considerable clarity, the nature of the trust that had been placed in her. Not merely the physical custodianship of the letters, but the more complex custodianship of the understanding required to handle them with the intelligence and sensitivity they deserved. Cornelius had known what he was leaving in her care, and he had trusted her to know what to do. And she had spent 3 years in a house no one else wanted, in solitude and cold, and the quiet work of maintenance, honoring that trust. He asked why she had stayed. Not logically, he amended. The arrangement was clear enough logically, but in the deeper sense, why she had not found another situation, another arrangement, once Cornelius was gone, and the manor's future was uncertain. She was quiet for a moment. That was not the quietness of evasion, but the quietness of genuine consideration. Then she said that she had nowhere else to go that felt like it had any claim on her, and that Blackthorn, for all its difficulty, had come to feel like a place she belonged to, in some way she could not fully articulate. She said that she suspected it sounded foolish. She did not apologize for it. He said that it did not sound foolish at all. On the 7th day, Calder completed his assessment and presented Henry with a document of considerable thoroughness and moderate grimness. The manor was, in Calder's professional estimation, structurally salvageable, but in need of significant and sustained investment. The roof of the south wing required replacement entirely. The plumbing throughout was of a vintage that made its continued function somewhat optimistic. The grounds would require years of work to restore to anything resembling their former state. The overall financial picture, Calder said, placing the document on the table with the gravity of a physician delivering a diagnosis, was not catastrophic, but it was not comfortable. Henry read the document with care and set it down. He looked through the window of the inn's small parlour at the village square, where the October light lay clean and pale on the stones, and at the church tower that had been standing since Elizabeth, and at the road that led through the ash trees to a house he had expected to sell, and was no longer certain he could bring himself to. He thought about Eleanor Whitcomb moving through rooms that no one else would have troubled to understand, keeping letters that no one else would have troubled to protect, building fires in empty fireplaces because the house deserved to have fires in it. He thought about the way she had said that keeping things was itself a form of love. He returned to the manor that afternoon. She knew something had changed, of course. She was perceptive in the way of people who have spent long periods in their own company and have consequently developed a finely tuned awareness of shifts in atmosphere. She received his arrival in the kitchen with the same composed attention she brought to everything, and she did not ask the obvious question, which he appreciated because he was not entirely certain yet what the answer was. He told her that the manor could be restored, that it would take time and money, both of which he was in the process of arranging, and that the process would be neither quick nor simple. He told her that he intended to undertake the restoration regardless. She looked at him with the grey-green eyes that gave away less than they seemed to, and said that she was glad to hear it, and that the house deserved to be saved. She said it without sentiment and without personal implication, and he found himself in the unusual position of wishing she had said something slightly more personal, which was itself informative. He said, measuring his words with the care of a man who is aware that some things, once said, cannot be unsaid, that he would need someone to assist with the restoration, someone who knew the house, who understood its history, who could advise on what was to be preserved and what had to be replaced, and why the distinction mattered. He said he would pay a reasonable wage, that the arrangement would be entirely proper, and that he would engage a housekeeper and additional staff before any extended occupation of the property, so that there could be no reasonable basis for any commentary of the kind that the village might otherwise be inclined to offer. Eleanor listened to all of this with the stillness she brought to decisions. He had learned, in 8 days, to read that stillness as a form of processing rather than hesitation, and he did not interrupt it. Outside, the wind moved through the ash trees with the sustained sound that had become, over the course of the week, as familiar to him as any sound in his own London house, which was a thought he set aside for later examination. She said that she appreciated the care with which he had framed the offer. She said it simply and without irony. She said that she would think about it. He did not press her. He left that afternoon to return to London, where his affairs demanded him, with an arrangement to return in 3 weeks, to consult with the architects and builders Calder had already begun engaging. He rode back through the ash trees in the grey afternoon, and felt, in some region of himself, that he was accustomed to regarding with a certain wariness something that had not been active there in quite some time. He had no specific name for it, and he did not immediately reach for one. London received him with the usual volume and complication, the accumulation of correspondence and obligations and social engagements that his title and his position generated with the relentlessness of natural phenomena. He attended the necessary dinners. He responded to the necessary letters. He sat across the desk from Calder and discussed the financial architecture of a restoration project that would have seemed 3 weeks prior an entirely implausible addition to his already complicated circumstances. He thought about Eleanor Whitcomb more than was perhaps strictly proportionate to the nature of their acquaintance. He thought about the way she held her cup with both hands in the cold kitchen, because the warmth of the ceramic was not a luxury, but a practical necessity. He thought about the expression she had worn, reading in her chair in the library, while he read through the letters. A private and unguarded expression that was visible only because she had not known she was being observed. He thought about the directness of her gaze, and the precision of her speech, and the quality she had of meaning exactly what she said, without embellishment or performance. He also thought with a particular clarity that 3 weeks of London and society provided about what the village of Ashwick would say, and what London would say, and what his own circle of acquaintances would say, about the renewed presence of an unmarried woman of no current fortune and a complicated family history at a property belonging to an unmarried duke. Society was not unkind precisely. It was merely unsparing, and Eleanor Whitcomb had already experienced in the years of her father's disgrace precisely how unsparing it could be. He was aware that he was thinking about this, not because it was his primary concern, but because it would be hers, and because he was already, without having formally acknowledged the fact to himself, approaching the matter from her perspective as well as his own.
It is indeed.
He returned to Somerset on the appointed day. The architects had been installed in the village inn. Calder had preceded him by 2 days and had begun the logistical arrangements with the brisk efficiency that made him indispensable. The restoration of Blackthorn Manor was, by the time Henry arrived, already a project with momentum. Eleanor was in the library when he arrived at the manor. She looked up from her book with the expression she wore when she was calibrating something, and said that she had decided to accept the position he had offered. He said that he was very glad to hear it. She said that she had 3 conditions. He said that he would hear them. The first was that her role be defined clearly and in writing, so that there could be no ambiguity about its nature. The second was that the letters be handled precisely as she had described, kept intact, and eventually conveyed to the appropriate family with appropriate discretion. The third was that he tell her honestly if he intended to sell the property once the restoration was complete, because she would rather know that now than invest the kind of attention she intended to invest, and then discover the house was only passing through his hands. He answered in order. The written definition was not only reasonable, but sensible, and he would arrange it. The letters would be handled exactly as she wished. And no, he did not intend to sell. He had not, he said, intended to restore a property he was going to sell. That was not the kind of restoration he was doing. She seemed to consider this. Then she said that she had one further question, that was not a condition, but that she wished to ask anyway. He said she should go ahead. She asked why. Given the expense and complication, he had decided to restore it. He was a man of considerable other responsibilities, she said, and the manor was, in honest terms, a liability. She asked what he saw in it that made the trouble worthwhile. Henry stood in the library of Blackthorn Manor, with the autumn light coming through the tall windows and the ash trees visible through the glass, their branches beginning to bear. and he considered how much of the truth to tell. He was a man who had spent his adult life in careful management of what he revealed of himself, not from dishonesty, but from the particular discipline that responsibility over time tends to install. He had found it useful, and he had found it safe, and he had found it occasionally quite lonely. He said that he had spent a week in a house that other people had decided was worthless, and that he had found in it something he had not expected to find, and that it seemed to him that things which are more than they appear on the surface are generally worth the effort of understanding better. Eleanor met his eyes and held them for a moment, and then said with the composure that was her most consistent quality, that she believed she understood what he meant. The restoration of Blackthorn Manor proceeded through the winter and into the spring. Henry came to Somerset as often as his affairs permitted, which was more often than those affairs strictly required, a fact that Calder noted in the accounts with the neutral precision of a man who noted many things and commented on very few of them. The south wing roof was replaced. The plumbing was modernized. The rooms were opened one by one to inspection and then to work. The dust removed and the walls assessed and the decisions made about what could be preserved and what had to be replaced. And Eleanor was present for all of it. Her knowledge of the house's history functioning as a guide through decisions that would otherwise have been made from ignorance. She moved through the renovation with the same composure she brought to everything, but with a quality of engagement that Henry watched carefully and with appreciation. When a decision was made that preserved something significant, a particular plasterwork ceiling in the first floor sitting room, a section of original tiling in the entrance hall, she responded with a satisfaction that was real and unperformed. When something could not be saved, she received the news with an honesty about her own regret that she did not pretend away. They fell into a rhythm of working days and quiet evenings, the latter spent in the library with the fire going properly now that the flues had been cleaned, and the former spent in the productive activity of building something out of what had been, for a long time, beyond building. Henry found that he looked forward to these days with a specific and particular anticipation that he recognized, with the self-honesty that he reserved for his most private thoughts, as something beyond interest in an architectural project. The village observed all of this with the attentiveness that small communities bring to the affairs of significant neighbours. The housekeeper Henry had engaged, a formidable woman from Frome named Mrs. Davenport, whose respectability was of the structural variety, built into the fabric of her character rather than merely worn on its surface, provided whatever propriety the arrangement required, and the formal definition of Eleanor's role as the manor's historical advisor and restoration consultant had been committed to paper and signed by both parties in the second week of November. And these things together offered the village and its opinions the necessary framework. But opinions, in Henry's experience, were not deterred by frameworks. He became aware, through the particular social intelligence that a lifetime of navigating English society installs, that the village had views about Eleanor Whitcomb that preceded his arrival in Ashwick by several years, rooted in the circumstances of her father's disgrace and the quiet oddity of her arrangement at the manor, and that these views had not been softened by the arrival of an unmarried duke, whose interest in the property seemed, to a discerning eye, to exceed the purely financial. He was aware of what this meant for her. It meant a narrowing of the space in which she could move without scrutiny. It meant that her composure was doing more work than it appeared to do, and he was aware, with an honesty he allowed himself only in private, that the difficulty of this was something he had created simply by being who he was and arriving in the way that he had arrived, and that the responsibility for it was his, and that he was obliged to think carefully about what that implied. He thought about it on a February evening, when the restoration was at a stage that allowed parts of the ground floor to be heated and used, and they were sitting in the restored drawing room for the first time, in chairs that had been recovered and put back in their proper positions. And the fire was sufficient to make the room genuinely warm. And Eleanor was reading, as she always read, with complete attention. And he was not reading at all, but rather watching the firelight on her profile and understanding, with a completeness that no longer required analysis, what it was he felt. He said her name. She looked up. She had a quality, in those moments of direct attention, of seeing him rather than seeing the Duke of Crestmore, and it was this that had, over the months of that winter, become to him the most essential thing. Most people, in his experience, saw the title first, and the man either never or much later. Eleanor Whitcomb had, from the first morning in the kitchen, appeared to see whatever was actually there. And this was the kind of thing that could, if one were not careful, alter one's entire understanding of what proximity to another person was supposed to feel like. He did not say what he had meant to say, not all of it. He said instead, with the care of a man who is managing himself, that he wished to know how she was. Not practically, not in the sense of the work, but genuinely. She set her book down and gave the question the seriousness it deserved, and said that she was, for the first time in several years, more well than not, and that she attributed this in part to the restoration, and in part to other things she was not yet prepared to name directly. He said that he understood. The understanding between them was, through the remainder of that winter and into the spring, composed of exactly this kind of exchange. Things said precisely, and things not said with equal precision, the combination of which produced a communication that was, he believed, more complete than a great deal of more explicit speech. There were evenings in the library and mornings at the work table in the restored kitchen, and afternoons walking the grounds, as the winter gave way to a spring that came gradually and then all at once. The ground's long-buried structure beginning to reassert itself beneath the retreating disorder. The bones of old gardens appearing under new growth. There was a morning in March, when the restoration of the library was being completed by a craftsman, restoring the shelving to its original configuration, that Eleanor found among the books a packet of papers she had not known was there, slipped behind a row of volumes that had sat undisturbed for long enough that they had been regarded as part of the architecture. The papers were Cornelius's handwritten notes he had made toward what appeared to be a memoir, fragmentary and unfinished, covering portions of his life and including passages about Catherine that were of a different nature than the letters, less formal, more immediate, the private thoughts of an old man setting down what had been the central truth of his life. Eleanor brought the papers to Henry that evening with an expression he had learned to read as the expression she wore when something had moved her genuinely, but she was not going to perform the fact of having been moved. She set them on the table and said that she thought they changed the picture somewhat, not in terms of what was done with the letters, but in terms of the understanding they permitted of the whole. He read them while she sat nearby, and when he was finished he set them down and said nothing for a moment, and she did not interrupt the silence. He said finally that Cornelius had been, in the ways that perhaps matter most, a man who understood what he had and was grateful for it, even when what he had was less than what he had wanted. Eleanor said that she found that a form of wisdom, not consolation. There was a difference, she said, between accepting a lesser thing and recognizing the full value of what remained. He looked at her across the firelight of the restored library and said that he agreed entirely, and the weight he gave the words was not disproportionate to the conversation about Cornelius, and she heard what was in the weight and met his eyes without looking away. The following morning she was in the garden when he arrived at the manor, standing at the edge of what the spring was revealing to be the remnants of a rose garden, her hands clasped behind her back in the stance she adopted when she was thinking. He came to stand beside her. The morning air smelled of turned earth and new growth, and the distant dampness of the stream that ran along the manor's eastern boundary. And the light was the clear pale gold of an English spring morning that has decided to be genuinely generous. He said, without looking at her but at the rose garden, that he had been giving a great deal of thought to a particular question, and that he had concluded he ought to ask it, because not asking seemed, in the context of who he had become over the course of the past several months, a form of dishonesty that he was no longer willing to practice. She stood very still, the stillness that was deliberation. He said that he was aware of the complications. He was aware of the disparity between their situations and the commentary that attended any movement in a particular direction. And he was aware that she had been on the receiving end of society's capacity for commentary before, and that he had no right to ask her to subject herself to it again on his account. He was aware that the offer he was considering making was one she might, for entirely reasonable and honourable reasons, choose to decline. He was prepared to accept that. He said this as though meaning it, which he did, though the prospect required a significant act of internal management to contemplate with any equanimity. Then he said that he was also aware that Blackthorn Manor was, in the fullest possible sense, a house worth restoring, and that the restoration had taught him something he had not known before he came here, and that he did not wish to be a man who learned important things and then acted as though he hadn't. Eleanor turned to look at him. Her face held the expression she wore when she had already decided something, but was not yet ready to confirm the decision. waiting for whatever final piece of information would settle it. He said her name again, quietly, in the way that names mean the most when they are said simply and with full attention. She said, after a silence that contained everything that silences of that particular quality contain, that she had thought the complications through herself, and that she had concluded that complications, while real, were not the same as impossibilities, and that she had spent 3 years in a house that other people had written off, and she had learned that things worth having were rarely without complication, and that the complication was not in itself a reason. She said that she would be honoured. The spring light lay across the remnants of the rose garden, and the ash trees were fully green now, their canopy restored to the thick, living density of summer. Inside the house, the craftsmen were at their work, and the sound of it, a distant, purposeful industry, carried through the open air with the quality of a place that had found its way back to itself. Henry stood in the morning of what would, in retrospect, become the first morning of a different kind of life, and felt the particular quality of a thing that has been earned rather than given, which is perhaps the finest quality anything can have. The letters of Catherine and Cornelius were, in the following months, conveyed with the discretion that Eleanor had promised to the family's living descendants, accompanied by a letter that Henry wrote and Eleanor read before it was sent. A letter that said, in the careful language appropriate to such a communication, that these papers represented something of value, and that they were offered in the spirit in which they had been kept, which was the spirit of love, enduring and precise and larger than the circumstances that had constrained it. The family received them with the gratitude of people who have been given, unexpectedly, a fuller account of someone they already loved. Blackthorn Manor, in the years that followed, became what it had not been in a long time. A place where light came in through open windows, and fires were built in fireplaces, not because the cold demanded it, but because warmth was a thing worth creating, and where the library collected new books alongside the old, and where the rose garden recovered itself with the patient stubbornness of things that have good roots, and a gardener who understands them. It was not a house without difficulty, because houses, like the people who live in them, do not become without difficulty. But it was a house that was tended, and it was a house that held its history with honesty rather than shame. And it was a house in which two people had found, against the ordinary predictions of circumstance, something that neither had expected to find when October began, and the ash trees closed over the carriage drive, and a cup sat clean and unused on a kitchen table, and a story that had not yet declared its own intentions was quietly preparing itself to begin.